Hello friends, today's topic is taxability or exemption of special allowances under clause 14 of section 10. In this topic we will be discussing what is the amount of exemption is available to the employee wherein special allowances are paid to him, and the provisions are covered under clause 14 of section 10. Now friends, let's start with section 10.14, or rather clause 14 of section 10, which mentions the taxability or exemption of special allowances received by the employee. These special allowances are provided to the employee either to meet expenses while he is on official tour, or it may be personal in nature as well. There are two parts to clause 14 of section 10. First part mentions that the special allowance which is received by the employee will be entirely exempt. However, the condition is that it should be expended. The allowances received from the employer should be expended for the purpose for which the same is given. And the second part is the special allowances that is received by the employee will be taxable subject to the limit prescribed by the rule. If it exceeds the limit prescribed, the same will be taxable in the hands of the employee. And for the second category, it doesn't matter whether any expenses are incurred by the employee or not. However, as soon as it exceeds the limit prescribed, it will be taxable in the hands of the employee. You will get a standard deduction of the limits prescribed, and amount over and above the limits prescribed will be subject to tax in the hands of the employee. So as far as the allowances is concerned, we have studied that there are categories which are fully taxable, there are categories which are partly taxable, and there are categories which are fully exempt. So in this topic, we will be discussing allowances which are partly exempt or partly taxable, and allowances which are fully exempt. First part, on your screen, section 10.14, special allowances to meet expenses relating to duties or personal expenses. This clause provides for exemption as per Rule 2BB in respect of the following. So the prescribed rules are mentioned under Rule 2BB. Special allowances or benefit not being in the nature of perquisite, benefit should not be in the nature of perquisite, specifically granted. Allowances specifically granted to meet expenses incurred wholly, necessarily, and exclusively in the performance of duties of office. Expenses incurred wholly, necessarily, exclusively in the performance of the duties of an office or employment of profit as per section 10.14.1. For the allowances under this category, there is no limit on the amount which the employee can receive from the employer. There is no limit on the amount which the employee can receive from the employer, but whatever amount is received should be fully utilized for the purpose for which it was given to him. So as we have discussed earlier, there will be no limit on the allowances that an employee will receive. However, the exemption will be available only if the amount is expended by the employee for the purpose for which it has been granted. Now the second category, which is 10.14.2, special allowances granted to the SSC either to meet his personal expenses at the place where the duties of his office or employment of profit are ordinarily performed by him, or at a place where he ordinarily resides, or to compensate him for the increased cost of living. So any allowances, again, allowances granted to the SSC to meet his personal expenses at the place where the duties of his office are ordinarily performed, or at a place where he resides, or to compensate him for increased cost of living, that will fall under section 1014(2). For this category of allowances, there is a limit on the amount which the employee can receive from the employer. There is a limit on the amount which the employee can receive from the employer. Any amount received by the employee in excess of the specified limits will be taxable in the hands as income from salary. So anything in excess of the limit will be subject to tax in the hands of the employee. It doesn't matter whether the amount which is received is actually spent or not by the employee for the purpose for which it was given to him. So there will be no tab on whether there is any expenditure incurred by him or not, by the employee or not, under section 1014(2). Only if it is exceeding the limits prescribed, then the same will be taxable in the hands of the employee, and again there will be no tab on the expenditure, whether any expenditure is actually incurred by the employee or not. So we have discussed 1014(1) and 1014(2). Now we will discuss the examples of allowances which are mentioned under the provisions. First, we will consider 1014(1), which are prescribed under Rule 2BB. Allowances prescribed for the purpose of Section 1014(1), which are mentioned in Rule 2BB1. First, any allowance granted to meet the cost of living, cost of travel on tour or on transfer. Any allowance for traveling, maybe on tour, maybe on transfer, that is the traveling allowance, will be exempt entirely, provided, again, the basic requirement is the expenses should be incurred. It should be shown that the expenditure are indeed incurred. Accordingly, any amount of allowance will be exempt in the hands of employee. Explanation: allowance granted to meet the cost of travel on transfer. So there are two parts over here: tour or transfer. So traveling cost is covered under traveling allowance. Traveling could be for tour. Tour is nothing but it may be an official tour, and it is relatively shorter than transfer. Official tour, it's like you are visiting outside India for the purpose of business, which could be for 1 week or 2 weeks, and it includes business visit. And transfer, in a way, could be a secondment arrangement wherein you are transferred to an entity, to a sister entity outside India, and it may extend to 1 or 2 years. So transfer is for a long-term purpose and tour is relatively shorter as compared to transfer. So cost of travel on tour, cost of travel on transfer. These are two aspects in traveling allowance. So under the explanation, it has been mentioned regarding the cost of travel on transfer. Allowances granted to meet the cost of travel on transfer includes any sum paid in connection with the transfer, packing and transportation of personal effects of such transfer. So as we have discussed that transfer is nothing but a relatively longer period for 1 or 2 years. So if an employee, for example, is going on secondment outside India to a sister entity, there will be expenses, there are bound to be expenses for packing and transportation in which his personal effects, the things which he requires personally, will be required to be packed and transported to the country outside India. So expenses related to it will be exempt under section 1014(1). So if you are going on transfer outside India, any related expenses thereto are also covered under the explanation, as per the explanation, wherein cost of travel on transfer includes any sum paid in connection with the transfer, packing and transportation of personal effects on such transfer. Fair enough. Second allowance. Any allowance, whether granted on tour or for the period of journey in connection with transfer. So whether on tour or whether on transfer, to meet the ordinary daily charges, to meet the ordinary daily charges incurred by the employee on account of absence from his normal place of duty. Header can be termed as daily allowance or per diem allowance. So, in our example, a person is seconded outside India to a sister entity. Now, as far as daily expenses are incurred for daily visiting from his accommodation to the office outside India, he will have to travel. So, there will be traveling expenditure. Secondly, the accommodation in which he is living, it could be hotel accommodation or residential accommodation. So, since it is for a long term period, it will be a housing accommodation, residential accommodation, and if he is on a tour, then he will reside in a hotel accommodation. So, whether on tour, whether on transfer, is bound to incur expenses on the accommodation, is bound to incur expenses on traveling, is bound to incur expenses for daily consumption, that is lunch, dinner. So these are sort of expenses which is bound to incur on daily basis as per section 1014(1) clause 2 of rule 2BB. These expenses are covered under clause 2 under this clause as daily allowance or per diem allowance, and it will be exempt to the extent of the daily expenses incurred. It will be exempt to the extent of amount expended by the employee. Again, any allowance whether granted on tour or on transfer to meet the ordinary daily charges incurred by the employee on account of absence of normal place of duty. So he is absent on from his normal place of duty in a way, since he is working in India, he is absent from this normal place of duty and he is seconded outside India, or either he is on business visit outside India. So he is absent from his normal place of duty in our example, and accordingly he will be eligible for exemption of the daily allowance or per diem allowance received in this course. Third part, any allowance granted to meet the expenditure incurred on conveyance in performance of duties of an office or employment of profit, which is termed as conveyance allowance. Such allowance would be exempt only if free conveyance is not provided by the employer. So if any conveyance allowance is provided by the employer which is related to expenditure incurred in the performance of duties of an office? If yes, then the conveyance allowance will be exempt in the hands of the employee. Any allowance granted to meet the expenditure incurred on a helper, as such helper is engaged in the performance of duties of an office or employment of profit, called as helper allowance. So in these clauses, you can see that everything should be related to the performance of duties of an office or employment or profit. Here also, in performance of duties of an office or employment of profit, clause 1, here there is no mention as such, but allowance is anything which is travel on tour or travel on transfer is for the purpose of business only. Even here, tour and transfer are for the purpose of business. So these allowances will be exempt provided they are incurred in the performance of duties of an office or employment of profit. Fourth was helper allowance. Fifth is research allowance. Any allowance granted for encouraging the academic research and training pursuits in educational and research institutions. Sixth, any allowance granted to meet the expenditure on the purchase or maintenance of uniform for wear during the performance of the duties of an office or employment of profit. So uniform allowance to meet the expenditure on the purchase and maintenance of uniform. Any uniform allowance paid and expenditure incurred thereon will be exempt as per section 10.14.1. Read with rule 2BB. So overall we have discussed 6 clauses for section 10.14.1 wherein there will be no limit on the allowances amount that will be received by the employee. However, it should be expended by the employee and it should be expended for the purpose of employment or in the performance of duties of official duties. First, traveling allowance. Second, daily allowance or per diem allowance. Third, conveyance allowance. Fourth, helper allowance, research allowance, and last one was uniform allowance. Now, 10.14.2, which are mentioned under Rule 2BB, Clause 2. In this part, to just quickly recap, in this, the expenditure incurred won't matter and the limit, if the allowance paid by the employer is within the limit prescribed as per Rule 2BB, then nothing will be taxable. If it is exceeding the limit, then he will get a deduction up to the limit and amount exceeding the limit will be taxable. First is special compensatory hilly area allowance. In this, there are series of allowances contained in the tabular form in which practically if you see it won't be of much relevance apart from 2 or 3 allowances, but theoretically you should be aware of these provisions. Accordingly, they have been mentioned in tabular form and we will quickly go through it once. First is special allowance, hilly area allowance, which is high altitude allowance, uncongenial climate allowance, snowbound area allowance, avalanche allowance. So in case of extreme circumstances, you can say hilly area allowance. Amount exempt from tax varies from rupees 300 per month to rupees 7,000 per month. So the range is between 300 to 7,000 per month for various allowances, and specifically 7,000 per month in Sechin area of Jammu and Kashmir. Second, border area allowance, remote area allowance, remote locality allowance, difficult area allowance, disturbed area allowance. For that, the amount exempt from tax varies from 200 per month to 1300 per month. So here also there will be a range mentioned under Rule 2BB for this various type of allowances. So if you see in the first category, we have consolidated all the allowance or the types of allowance which are similar in nature over here. First was hilly area allowance, which will stand in the range of anything between 300 per month to 7,000 per month, and border area allowance, difficult area allowance, or disturbed area allowance. The exemption would be in the range of anything between 200 per month to 1300 per month as per Rule 2BB. Tribal areas or scheduled areas is 200 per month. 200 per month includes agency area allowance and it is limited to specific states: Madhya Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, Tripura, Assam, West Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. So these are the states mentioned under Rule 2BB, wherein 200 per month will be the allowance which will be exempt. Anything in excess of 200, for example 1000 per month, then only 800 per month will be taxable. Next is compensatory field area allowance, specified areas in specified states. 2600 per month is the exemption amount, and there is a note mentioned wherein if this exemption is taken, which is the compensatory field area allowance, employee cannot claim any exemption in respect of border area allowance. So either you take border area allowance, which is mentioned over here in the range of 200 to 1300 per month, or either you take compensatory field area allowance. Both cannot be taken simultaneously. Next is compensatory modified area allowance, specified areas in specified states. If this exemption is taken, employee cannot claim any exemption in respect of border area allowance, and the limit is 1000 per month. Counter insurgency allowance granted to members of armed forces operating in areas away from their permanent locations, 3900, and restriction of border area allowance. Underground allowance is granted to employees working in uncongenial, unnatural climate in underground mines, 800 per month. Up to 800 per month is the limit. High altitude allowance is granted to armed forces operating in high altitude areas, up to 1060 per month for a range of altitude, and up to 600 per month for altitude above 15,000 feet. Highly active field area allowance granted to members of armed forces, 4,200 per month. Island duty allowance granted to members of armed forces in Andaman and Nicobar and Lakshadweep group of islands, up to 3,250 per month. Now the next set of allowances which will you may encounter frequently and practically also it has relevance. Children education allowance, up to 100 per month per child. Up to a maximum of 2 children is exempt. So the limit of 100 per month is per child and only 2 children are allowed for the purpose of exemption. Hostel expenditure, the limit is 300 per month per child and maximum up to 2 children. Transport allowance granted to an employee to meet expenditure for the purpose of commuting between place of residence and place of duty. This is applicable only up to 3,200 per month, granted to an employee who is blind or deaf and dumb or orthopedically handicapped with the disability of lower extremities. So if the employee is blind or deaf and dumb or handicapped, then the exemption which is allowed is 3,200 per month, and the same will be allowed for the purpose of transport between place of residence and place of duty. Transport allowance to an employee working in any transport business to meet his personal expenditure during his duty performed in the course of running of such transport from one place to another place, provided employee is not in receipt of daily allowance. For example, a truck driver, he wants to travel from Delhi to Mumbai. So this will be a long journey where he needs to transport the goods of the employer from Delhi to Mumbai. So it may take 2 to 3 days for him to travel. So any personal expenditure incurred by him while on travel from Delhi to Mumbai can be termed into transport allowance, and accordingly the amount of exemption for such expenditure incurred amount of exemption shall be lower of the following: 70% of such allowance or 10,000 per month. So again, as we have discussed earlier, this expenses under 1014.2, the actual expenditure doesn't matter. The employee will get a standard deduction of the amount mentioned under Rule 2BB. So these are examples of allowance wherein the employee will get a standard deduction of the amount mentioned in the second column. So for transport allowance, where an employee is traveling on one cut start, where the employee is traveling from one place to another and he's working in any transport business, the employer is into transport business, so the employees working under such employer will be eligible for exemption of 70% of the amount of the allowance or 10,000 per month, whichever is lower. So from practicality point of view, children education allowance of 100, hostel expenditure allowance of 300 per month per child, maximum up to 2 children, transport allowance from place of residence to place of duty paid to a employee who is blind, deaf and dumb or handicapped employee, and transport allowance paid to an employee who is working with a transport business employer. Employer is into transport business. Any exemption, the exemption to the employee to such employee is 70% of the allowance or 10,000 per month, whichever is lower. From practicality, this allowance are relevant. Now friends, the allowances which are fully exempt, let's discuss this one by one. Allowance to High Court judges. Any allowance paid to a judge of High Court under Section 22A(2) of the High Court Judges Condition of Service Act 1954 is not taxable and is exempt fully. Allowance paid by the United Nations Organization to its employees is not taxable by virtue of Section 2 of United Nations Privileges and Immunities Act 1947. Compensatory allowance under section 222 of the Constitution, received by judge under article 222 of the Constitution. So this is article and not section. Article 222 of the Constitution is not taxable since it is neither salary nor perquisite. Vishambar Dayalav, CIT versus CIT. So compensatory allowance received under article of the Constitution is exempt from tax. Sumptuary allowance, which is nothing but personal expenditure allowance paid to the judges. Sumptuary allowance given to High Court judges under Section 22C of the High Court Judges Act 1954 and Supreme Court judges under Section 23B of the Supreme Court Judges Act 1958 is not chargeable to tax. Allowances payable outside India, Section 1070, mentioned under clause 7 of section 10, any allowances which is paid outside India to a citizen of India by the government of India is exempt. And if you will remember, there were specific allowances which were deemed to accrue or arise in India as per section 9, wherein salary and allowances paid, or rather allowances and perquisites paid to the Indian citizen, to an Indian citizen by the government of India, will be deemed to accrue or arise in India even if services are rendered outside India. To that effect, the allowances which are payable outside India to such citizen of India will be exempt under clause 7 of section 10. Allowances or perquisites paid or allowed as such outside India by the government of India to a citizen of India for services rendered outside India are exempt from tax under 10(7). In such cases, under section 913, the income chargeable under the head salaries is deemed to accrue or arise in India. So, a citizen of India receiving any allowances or perquisite from government of India will be first included under the head salaries as deemed to accrue or arise in India even if services are rendered outside India. So first it will be included under the head salaries and then it will be exempted under clause 7 of section 10. Moving on to next exemption, exemption of specified allowances and perquisites paid to chairman or retired chairman or any other member or retired member of the UPSC. UPSC is nothing but United Public Service Commission, Union Public Service Commission. So there are four factors in it, four components to it: chairman and member. Chairman may be retired or in service, member may be retired or in service. There are different provisions. There is different provision for retired personnel and there are different provision for the personnel who are in service. And here we are talking about the chairman and the member of the UPSC, Union Public Service Commission. Perquisites and allowances received by an employee are taxable under the head salaries unless they are specifically exempted. So generally, perquisites and allowances are taxable in the hands of employee as income under the head salaries unless they are specifically exempted, obviously which are mentioned under section 1014. So 1045 exempts specified allowances and perquisite received by the chairman or any other member, including retired chairman or member of the Union Public Service Commission. So specified allowances and perquisites mentioned under clause 45 of section 10 are exempted when the same are paid to chairman whether retired or not, member whether retired or not of the UPSC, Union Public Service Commission. The exemption would be available in respect of such allowances, such perquisite as may be notified by the central government in this behalf. So, which exemption will be exempt is the exemption, the components which are notified by the central government in the official gazette. Central government has notified following allowances and perquisites for serving chairmen and members of UPSC for the purpose of exemption. The following allowances and perquisites are notified by the central government for the serving chairman and the serving members of UPSC. Value of rent-free official residence would be exempt for the serving chairman and serving members. Value of conveyance facilities including transport allowance, sumptuary allowance paid to the serving chairman and the serving members, and value of leave travel concession. All these four allowances will be exempt as per clause 45 of section 10 in the hands of serving chairman, in the hands of serving member. What about in the case of retired chairman and retired members of UPSC? The following has been notified by the central government for the purpose of exemption under section 1045. First, a sum of maximum of 14,000 per month for defraying the service, for providing the service of an orderly and for meeting expenses incurred towards secretarial assistance on contract basis. So the sum over here mentioned for the prescribed services is 14,000 per month, which will be exempt in the hands of retired chairman and retired member of UPSC. The value of a residential telephone free of cost and the number of free calls to the extent of 1500 per month over and above free calls per month allowed by the telephone authorities. So second exemption is related to the residential telephone which is provided free of cost and number of free calls therein. Note, tax exemption is also available in respect of certain specified perquisites enjoyed by Chief Election Commissioner and judges of Supreme Court on account of the enabling provisions in the respective acts which govern their service condition. So, this exemption mentioned under clause 45 of section 10 is over and above the exemption which is eligible, which is applicable to Chief Commissioner, Chief Election Commissioner and judges of Supreme Court in their respective acts. The exemption under section 1045 does not affect the exemption mentioned under respective act of certain person. It is over and above those exemptions. Illustration: Mr. X has two sons. He is in receipt of children education allowance of 150 per month for his elder son and 70 per month for his younger son. But both his two sons are going to school. He also receives the following allowances: transport allowance 1800 per month, travel allowance of 500 per month. We are expected to compute his taxable allowances. So friends, we will have to analyze the allowances which are exempt or the taxable allowance amount in the hands of Mr. X. In this case, first allowance is children education allowance. The limit of exemption as per rule 2BB is 100 per month per child. Accordingly, elder son 150 per month is paid. 150 minus 100 is the amount taxable. 50 amount will be taxable per month. And younger son, amount paid is 70. This entire amount will be exempt. In no case, there shouldn't be case that cumulatively, since there are two child, the 200 per month limit will be applicable. It's not the case. The exemption is available per child, and the elder son in this case is 150. Accordingly, 50 per month will be taxable. It is not that the remaining amount in the younger son, which is 70, so 30 per month is remaining. It cannot be utilized against the elder son. This is not the case. So limit is to be seen per month per child. So in this case, elder son 50 per month is the taxable amount, and for younger son nothing is taxable. For transport allowance will be exempt entirely as 1800 per month. So transport allowance can be considered as nil over here, assuming that there are two types of transport allowance over here which we have studied. First, the employee who receives the transport allowance is either blind, deaf or handicapped, and the amount exempt in his case is 3200 per month. And another set of transport allowance is to an employee who is working in transport business, wherein 70% of such allowance or 10,000 per month, whichever is lower, is the amount of exemption. So in this case, we can see there is no such info. So we can assume that assignee, the employee, is assuming that employee is eligible for the exemption for transport allowance as per rule 2BB. In absence of information, we can mention it over here from the start. In absence of information, we have assumed that employee is eligible for exemption for transport allowance as per rule 2BB. There are two types of transport allowance. You can mention this in the notes. First is for blind, deaf or a handicapped person, wherein 3200 per month is allowed, or either the transport allowance exemption is applicable to a transport business. Employer is into transport business. In that case, 70% or 10,000 per month, whichever is lower, is the exemption amount. So in that case, you can assume that the person is either blind, deaf or handicapped, and the entire amount will be exempt. In this case, 1800 per month will be exempt. So this is what we have assumed, and in the examination you can always put a note saying that the transport allowance is applicable to the employee and the employee is eligible for the transport allowance as per rule 2BB. So nothing is taxable. Accordingly, nil has been written. Tribal area allowance is exempt up to 200 per month. So 500 minus 200 is nothing but 300 per month will be taxable in the hands of Mr. X. So total taxable allowance is nothing but 50 per month for children education allowance and 300 per month. So 350 per month is the taxable amount. So this was the end of the solution, wherein total taxable allowance in the hands of Mr. X for the assessment year 2021 is 350 per month. Now the next illustration. Mr. X, an employee, was sent to US in connection with the project of the firm's client for 2 months in the previous year. In addition to his salary, the firm paid per diem allowance for the period when he worked in US to meet expenses on boarding and lodging. So in our example, we had discussed that a person going on transfer, cost of travel on transfer, where a person is seconded. So in that case, the charges for traveling, the charges for daily consumption, the charges for residential accommodation or hotel accommodation, those cases will be termed as daily allowance, daily charges allowance or per diem allowances, and that is covered under section 10.14.1 of rule 2BB1, and the entire allowance will be exempt provided expenditure are incurred by the employee. Similarly, in this case also, Mr. A is sent to US and he is receiving per diem allowance. Tax was not deducted at source from such allowance by the employer. Mr. A did not include such allowance in computation of his taxable salary for the relevant assessment year. So neither employer deduct any taxes, neither Mr. A has offered anything in his return of income. In the course of assessment of Mr. A, under section 143(3), the assessing officer sent a notice to him asking him to explain why the per diem allowance received by him should not be charged to tax. Mr. A has sought your advice. So in this case, you can see the per diem allowance is not offered to tax by the employee, and in this regard, a notice is issued by the assessing officer asking him why this amount should not be offered to tax, and Mr. A has sought your advice in this regard. So, as per section 10.14.1, read with rule 2BB, a person is allowed an exemption of the amount of per diem allowance if such expenditure is indeed incurred by the employee. The only thing is, in this case, the employee should have first offered the per diem allowance, first mention the per diem allowance in the computation, and thereafter an exemption as per section 10 should have come across. So in this case, there is nothing which is wrong that the employer has done. I mean, they have rightly not deducted the taxes because it is not taxable at all. So employer is right in his place where TDS is not deducted. Employee is right, Mr. A is right in his sense that nothing is taxable accordingly. He also hasn't paid any taxes thereon because the same is exempt as per section 10.14.1 read with rule 2BB. The only thing on a precautionary basis or only thing which is right that should have been done by Mr. A was to mention that in the return of income as taxable salary as taxable allowances, and thereafter an exemption should have been mentioned as section 10.14 exemption of per diem allowance. So to answer this question, Mr. A is right of what he has done, wherein nothing will be taxable. The per diem allowance won't be taxable in his hands, and he has rightly not offered to tax the per diem allowance. So the illustration related to the allowances which are exempt, the 10.14 illustration, section 10.14, we conclude this, and this was the last illustration part in a series of allowances that we have seen are either exempt or taxable in the hands of the employee under clause 14 under section 10. So from starting, we have seen 1014(1) read with rule 2bb, wherein the expenses, wherein the allowances will be fully exempt under section 1014(1), wherein the allowance will be entirely exempt if expenses are incurred by the employee under section 1014(1). Second category is allowances will be exempt to the extent of limits prescribed under Rule 2BB. There is set of allowances mentioned, which is traveling allowance under 1014(1), traveling allowance, daily allowance, per diem allowance, conveyance allowance, helper, research, and uniform allowance. And for 1014(2), practically this allowance, which is border allowance, compensatory allowance, won't be relevant, but theoretically you should know them. Underground allowance, high altitude allowance, island duty allowance, then children education allowance, hostel, transport allowance are practically useful. Then there is a set of allowances related to judges of High Court, Supreme Court, wherein these allowances will be fully exempt if certain conditions are satisfied. And section 1045, wherein exemption is provided to the members or chairman, which may be either retired or in service, which are working with UPSC. The entire amount received will be taxable. The entire amount received will be exempt under section 1045. And then two illustrations. So this concludes the part of allowances which are exempt under clause 14 of section 10. Thank you.